We are at past whenever you were ready, Chair.
Okay, right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the meeting of the Standards Committee. It's the 11th of January, and can I bid you all a welcome and a very happy new year. Can I please remind you to switch off your phones, switch them off, or switch them to silent for the duration of the meeting. In addition, can I refer you to the protocols for remote meetings, namely, your microphone should be switched to mute unless you are speaking. The Democratic Service Officer will take a roll call at the start of the meeting of all members and officers. Should you wish to ask a question or make a comment, can you please indicate via the chat function or by raising your electronic hand via Teams. Well, if you didn't know, I'm Cliff Jones, the Chair. And Tammy, please, could you take the roll call?
Certainly, Chair, thank you. I've marked yourself as present. We also have Vice Chair Barbara Richards.
Morning.
Morning,
Barbara. Councillors Dennis Keogh. Oh, you're on the...
They're all present.
Thank you, Councillor. And Councillor Sharon Freegard.
Morning, Sharon. Morning, Dennis.
Thank you.
Morning.
Co-optees Louise Fleet.
Morning.
Morning, Louise.
Tom Maunt.
Morning, Tom.
Morning and Happy New Year, everyone.
And you, Tom.
Morning, Tom. Jerry Reynolds is not present, Chair.
Okay.
Officers, we have Craig Griffiths, Head of Legal Services.
Tammy.
Thank you, Craig. And myself, Tammy Davis, the Democratic Services Officer. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Tammy. That means record it and we can go ahead. Agenda item 2 on our agenda is Chair's announcements, and I can confirm I have no announcements from myself, so we can move on, I think, to agenda item 3, and that's declarations of interest. Are there any interest to declare? Please indicate by raising your electronic hand via Teams or via the chat function, and when called, state the details. Tammy will forward an electronic version of the form for you to complete and email back to her.
I see none, Chair.
No declaration of interest. We're whizzing through, Tammy. We're on agenda item 4. The minutes of the previous meeting held on the 7th of September 2021 are set out at pages 5 to 7 of your document bundle. Are there any comments to make on these minutes? If no comments, can I have a proposal and a seconder to approve the minutes, please? If there's anyone against, please indicate by raising your electronic hand. Any abstentions, please indicate by raising your electronic hand. Yes, Dennis, you did propose?
Second, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Louise. All right, so that's done. It's agenda item 5, the Public Service Ombudsman for Wales Annual Report. Can I ask Craig Griffiths to introduce the report, which is on pages 9 to 34 of your report pack.
Thank you very much, Chair. So a happy new year to all members of the Standards Committee, and thank you for coming together today as our usual custom. So this is a report ultimately that we bring to the Standards Committee on an annual basis. We're fortunate enough that the Ombudsman's Office produces to us a document annually, which effectively sets out the number of complaints that they received concerning Neath Talbot Council. It's designed in 2 areas, the first being our sort of service related issues and the various complaints ultimately associated with that, and secondly then the number of complaints in respect of our monitoring officer related functions of the Code of Conduct. So that's relating to the County Borough Council and Town and Community Councils. The first principle to note is that this is for the year 2020 to 2021. So it is obviously a year ago now with this information that we are looking at. But overall, the results are fairly positive, which was one of the pleasant things to see in it. When you look at, first of all, the service-related complaints, they have been lower than previous years. And when you look at it on the basis of population size, we are perhaps one of the lowest now ultimately in Wales. And similarly as well then, from a Code of Conduct perspective, our results results were actually very low for the 2020-2021 year. There were only 2 complaints ultimately against county borough councillors, which were not taken any further, and they were immediately dismissed by the Ombudsman. And there only ended up being 2 complaints in respect of community councils, which again were not taken any further by the Ombudsman. So overall, for the 2020-2021 year, our results were quite positive in the sense that we didn't have anything that needed to be referred ultimately to the Standards Committee, and the Ombudsman decided not to consider any of the issues that were ultimately raised as well. So we continue to take some of the practice that we've developed during that period and how we continue to work with partners to be able to try and reduce the possibility of any complaints coming forward. You'll see, for example, in paragraph 12 on my report, which is on page 11, some of the things that we look at in respect of the service perspective in trying to deal with matters. So ultimately, individuals are not remaining aggrieved, so they don't have to go to the Ombudsman. We try to share good practice ultimately throughout the council as well to make sure that officers are aware of the different ways in trying to deal with complaints, and obviously then trying to take advantage of some of the things that individual officers will have learned and how they've dealt with matters, and to make sure that element is spread. We also have been trying to focus specifically on some training related matters as well. So earlier on in the year, we did last year now, we did some refreshers on code of conduct training for our county borough councillors. We also continue to liaise with our town and community councils via the forum. And of course, in the last meeting, you would have seen some clerks who provided an indication of some of the issues that they are dealing with when it comes to code of conduct. But overall, ultimately, progress seems to have been very good within 2020-21, and hopefully it will continue as we move forward, Chair. So I'd be glad to answer any questions that the members may have on this particular report, Chair.
Thank you very much, Kate. Do members have any questions? Yeah, Sharon. Sorry, Louise.
Yeah. Yes, I just wondered, Craig, thank you very much for the report, and very, very positive messages there. I just wondered, you've been doing the training, which presumably is online. Have you had a better attendance rate because it has been online, and therefore, every cloud has a silver lining, doesn't it? So perhaps that's a positive thing which has taken place.
Very much so, by the Chair. Ultimately, we found that attendance does tend to be a lot more better in this sort of scenario when we've been doing these sort of events. I've also found them people to be much more engaged with it because they've been willing to ask questions. Maybe they may not necessarily have asked ultimately in person, whether they've utilised the chat facility as opposed to having to say things verbally. But it's been an ideal opportunity to refresh on basic principles ultimately, and attendance much better compared to what we had when we've done these sessions in person. Similarly as well, when I've undertaken some training for town and community councils over the last year, attendance for those has been much better. A couple of years ago when I did one, I think I had about 2 or 3 people in attendance. When I did one a couple of months ago, there were about 15 in attendance. Yeah. So it's been positive to see people have been much more engaged when they have the possibility of signing in remotely from the comfort of their own home. They can take part, they can listen, and it works. So I think that's something we are very keen ultimately to continue as we move forward in trying to allow training to take place in what we call a hybrid manner. So we will have people who wish to attend in person, they can attend as they would anything. But if you've got people who wish to be at home, attend in that way, they will have that flexibility as well at the same time. So we're just trying to design packages now which can hopefully be open to all.
Yes, yeah, no, that's good to hear. And after the elections, you're going to be doing a lot of training, aren't you? So that's going to be a really useful way to be able to do it and to get through your programme. Thank you, Craig.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. Anybody else have any questions for Craig?
No.
I think I spotted a typing error. It's just, I'm showing off just to show that I did read the report. But on page 15, the Ombudsman's letter to the leader, he refers to Councillor Edward Latham.
Oh, yes, yeah.
But the letter is addressed to Councillor Jones. That's on page 15. If you go to page 25, where it's the same thing in Welsh, he does refer to him as Councillor Latham. So it's a minor detail, but it's me showing off to show that I did read it.
And it has been raised with the Ombudsman, Chair, and I was hopeful we would still get revised versions ultimately would come through from them, but sadly I haven't received anything to date. But it has been well made with the Ombudsman that there is a mistake in that error.
Right, thank you very much, Craig. Any other questions? Well, if not, can I say that this report is just for noting and there's nothing further on this item, which moves us on to agenda item 6, and that's grant of dispensations. Craig, could you please introduce this report for us?
Of course I can, Chair. So this is actually one of the first types of these reports that the Standards Committee will have had. You've obviously been well versed in granting dispensations to county borough councillors in respective matters, but this is one of the first occasions in recent times that we've had a request from community councillors in respect of dispensations to enable them to take part in their community council meetings. The legal principles that ultimately go with it are exactly the same. So the rules in which you would be looking at are very similar to county borough councillors as they would be to community councils as well. So that's one positive in which to start with. So the Standards Committee received an application from community councillor Sonia Reynolds and community councillor Sarah Thomas in respect of the organisation Canolfan Mardi. So Canolfan Mardi is a community anchor organisation for the Amman Valley, which is recognised for providing significant community benefit. And Councillor Thomas and Councillor Reynolds are both trustees of that organisation. Now, usually that would mean when matters then are before the community council, because of their role with the organisation, they would have to declare a personal or prejudicial interest in respect of matters, meaning they wouldn't be able to take part in that various processes. However, there would be some occasions which the legislation does allow them ultimately to speak because of the expertise that they can bring, and obviously the role of this particular organisation within the community as well that the organisation is based. So having looked at the legislation, it does particularly allow the Standards Committee to grant a dispensation to allow these two councillors to speak and vote on issues relating to the business of Canolfan Mardi, but there are going to be some exemptions ultimately from that, in that they wouldn't be able to vote on anything that directly financially or disadvantages themselves or a particular member of their family. If it relates to a grant application or consideration of a contract between Canolfan Mardi and the council, and that the dispensation will not apply where a member of the public might reasonably conclude that the role of the trustee would significantly affect the councillor's ability to act purely on merits. So it's not going to be a cast all vote where basically they will be able to take part in any matter. There will be some restrictions to it, and they will be required to monitor those, and I'll be providing some advice to the clerk and to the community councillors as to how they should then utilise that particular dispensation when the opportunity presents itself. But legally, the Standards Committee are allowed to grant a dispensation in these circumstances. And so the recommendation ultimately before members today is that you do grant a dispensation, but obviously on the basis of the exemptions which are built then in paragraph 9 of your report, to make sure that it just covers off enough to make sure that the members of the public are confident that any decisions would be in the interest of the community council and not Canolfan Mardi at that point. So recommendation is on paragraph 17 of page 37 in your reports, and it's just recommended that it runs now until our annual meeting in the later part of this year. So it will be running now for the next few months, just for any sort of major decisions that particular community council has to take, Chair. So happy to answer any questions that members may have on that, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Craig. Do members have any questions for Craig on this? No, I see shaking it. Incidentally, Craig, I don't know about everyone else, but your screen is frozen.
Oh.
No, I'm fine. It's fine with me.
All right. It's the air in Gleis, it must be. And there's, again, I'm nitpicking again, but on page 36, paragraph 9, it says to speak and vote on issues relating to the business of Canolfan Mardi, and it's spelled Canolfan.
I'll correct that, Chair, in the dispensation, not an issue.
I'm in a nitpicking mood this morning. Sorry about that. But anyway, if there aren't any questions to Craig on this grant of dispensation, The recommendation is at paragraph 17, as Craig pointed out, on page 37 of the report. Please can I have a proposer and seconder to approve the minute, please?
Proposed, Chair.
Anyone against, please indicate by raising your electronic hand. Similarly,
sorry.
any abstentions, please.
Ignore that. Right.
So it's all in favour?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So that's approved, Craig. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Agenda item 7 is an independent review of ethical standards. And this I know is, I think, going to be of interest to us. And I'm going to ask Craig to introduce the report, which is on pages 39 to 100 of the report pack. If you could do that for us, please, Craig.
Of course I can, Chair, so thank you for this. So yeah, this is perhaps a very interesting report and something that's ongoing at the moment, and something probably that we'll be reviewing in a little bit more detail now as time ultimately progresses over the next year or two. At the start of it is that back then last year, it was decided that there needed to be a review of the requirements built into the Members' Code of Conduct and some of the arrangements ultimately related to that. These types of reviews happen frequently, but it was decided that the Members' Code of Conduct just needed to be looked at to make sure that it's up to date and reflects then the requirements of society when it comes to our elected members and the rules ultimately that they have to follow. So Welsh Government commissioned an independent review at this stage, and what we're seeing before members today is the first part of that review, where there's been some discussion with various bodies and various different organisations just to highlight some of the issues ultimately that do need to be considered as part of this review, and ultimately with the aim of determining whether the Code of Conduct is fit for purpose or whether any additional amendments have to be made to it. So the review itself is quite detailed, and there is an executive summary which is based on of the document, which obviously I can highlight members to, but included in your report are some overall findings and some commentary relating to various parts. What I propose to do is just talk a little bit about these ultimately with members today and highlight some of the issues ultimately that we will be looking at, and hopefully then we can have a bit of a discussion if there are any questions specifically members have. So turning to page 41 of your reports and the sections there which mark the various findings. One of the points that was pointed out was that there's an audit of Code of Conduct adopted by all the required authorities, and what it looked at is a model Code of Conduct. So back in the days when we first created our Code of Conduct, Welsh Government kindly provided a model Code of Conduct effectively for authorities to adopt, and there was no compulsion ultimately to adopt it, and every authority made their own minor changes obviously to reflect local needs at the time. We have adopted it pretty much for the most part, other than a couple of minor different elements, and we've added our own specific protocol. So for example, local resolution, which is when we try to avoid disputes without it having to go to the Ombudsman, and try and have a form of mediation ultimately between members. So we do have our own little bespoke arrangements here in Neath Talbot, but overall we are pretty compliant with the model code itself. One of the key issues then it chose to look at was the concept of mandatory training ultimately for town community councillors and county borough councillors. Now I should add, here in Neath Talbot we've never made it mandatory at this point. There are some town and community councillors within the county borough who do have mandatory training because that's something which their council ultimately resolved to do at that point. And one of the recommendations ultimately from the report is that mandatory training end up being introduced and all authorities go to that model. It's caused a little bit of debate, and there's been a number of different issues which have been raised in respect of that. Specifically, one of the ones I've mentioned there is what would be the case if we have complaints that are coming through, people are aware ultimately of the Code of Conduct obligations that they need to follow, but obviously their behaviour has still ultimately been in breach of it. So there has been that question mark as to whether mandatory training is potentially the way forward here, but it is something ultimately we'll be able to look at down the line. The second part as well was, well, what would be the sanction ultimately if somebody doesn't take part in mandatory training? Does that mean they are disqualified as a member? Does it mean, for example, they wouldn't be entitled to claim any members' allowance as a result of it? So there are some questions that need to be considered in amongst all of that as to, well, what would be the consequences if training then ultimately isn't complied with within a certain time scale? Obviously, as well, I think you can't say that people will be trained within 1 week of being appointed. We need to try and put some measures in place to make it more manageable ultimately for it. There has then been some consideration as to some of the basic principles having to be updated within the Code of Conduct. I think one of the key concerns that's come out of the report is the concept of social media. Obviously, when the Members' Code of Conduct was designed many a year ago, it was never really designed in light of some of the recent technological advancements and the way in which we communicate now via social media. So potentially there needs to be some reflection and some changes just to make sure there's some loose ends are tied up then as well. And specifically then a number of amendments then ultimately to the code, just to look at arrangements, obviously, to make some consistency in respects of gifts and hospitality, making sure that it's updated in respect of our Equality Act obligations. Some interesting ones specifically there, the one that says an obligation of the member to report their own criminal behaviour as well as that of others. Touch wood, it's never really a major issue when usually if there is criminal behaviour it is reported, but specifically putting an onus on the member to raise those issues ultimately with the monitoring officer. The one though that seems to be causing a lot of concern though at this stage amongst monitoring officers and standards committees in general, from what I understand, is that the local resolution process at the moment is optionary. So there's no requirement ultimately to go through that. And in the majority of complaints, local resolution really isn't the way forward. What is now being suggested is that before the Public Service Ombudsman makes any determination on any code of conduct violation, it should first be given back to the monitoring officer to decide ultimately whether local resolution could be utilised, and for them to engage in that process before the Ombudsman will ultimately consider it. I think it's part of an aim where the Ombudsman is trying to reduce their overall caseload of matters to consider by passing more matters back to the local authority to consider. You can understand the principles ultimately that sit behind that, because if you can try and resolve things more amicably, then there may be a benefit that ultimately comes with it. But one of the concerns at this stage is that we're going to be in a position where that will cause more work ultimately to the monitoring officer to ultimately then engage in that local resolution process and to be able to try and resolve matters before ultimately it gets to the Ombudsman stage. Similarly as well, for example, under our local resolution process, there are options where matters can be considered by the Standards Committee as a sort of an independent or final arbitrator in various matters. So there is the potential ultimately for more matters then to come back before the Standards Committee at the same time as well. Now, for the most part, in respect of the county borough councils, we think that is somewhat manageable. But when you look at it with the number of town and community councillors that we have and a lot of the complaints that ultimately stem relating to them, that's where we worry about the potential workload consequences that could bring. I mentioned in the report, obviously, that an average of 10 complaints about town and community councils per annum. You've heard me mention previously on the 2020 to 2021, we only had 2 or 3 in that sense. I've used the figure 10 there, looking back at previous years and ultimately to see which sort of proviso that ultimately brings there. So it is a resource implication. It's ultimately going to be bringing for that, but we have to see which way that works out then as well. They're also going to be looking at some changes then in respect of how we conduct hearings. We've had a few hearings, obviously, in Neath Talbot Standards Committee over the last few years. We've dealt with those predominantly via written representations. What they're looking at is trying to make some changes, obviously, just to make the process a little bit more structured, and obviously then consider various matters in respect of any witnesses who would need to attend then as well. And specifically then as well, looking at how we as a standards committee can play more of an active role in town and community council matters as well, and how we can have more powers in able to direct members of town and community councils in certain ways. So I think that's certainly welcome. We found, for example, we've had a lot of engagement with town and community councils over the last few years, perhaps more than we've ever had. So I think welcoming more powers for us to be able to intervene or to be able to make recommendations or to be able to issue certain matters to the town and community councils could certainly be very beneficial in that sense as well, and will give the Standards Committee a more updated role going forward. I think it's important, obviously, as well, that we look at ways in which we can work with other standards committees at the same time as well, because no doubt the issues which NPT are facing, other authorities are ultimately facing at the same time as well. So there is some discussion about how we can collaborate and how we can share good practice and all of those matters as well. The North, for example, have a North Wales forum for standards where the chairs, vice chairs and other members come together to discuss various issues. There are now some discussions whether in due course we will look at that for the South as well. So there's certainly some potential changes coming up which could be of benefit here to standards committees going forward. So some interesting times ahead ultimately is where this is going, and probably we are going to see the standards regime develop and change as time progresses. It's going to start in a little bit more detail from May this year following local government elections, where, for example, there'll be the duty on group leaders to engage with the standards committee as well. So the remit of standards is certainly going to be given a lot more attention and going to be given a little bit more clout, is probably the best way to describe in different ways, so we can get more involved in various matters as well. So a lot of these principles are certainly going to be welcomed. I think it'll just be interesting to see the finer detail so we can work out the impact ultimately it's going to have. So there's certainly a lot that I've run through there, Chair. I'm happy to answer any questions that members may have and hopefully raise any queries from that point.
Thank you, Craig. Yeah, that was very interesting. Do any of our members have questions for Craig on this item? I'm sure you do. Oh, quite, Craig. I'm going to say I would welcome, I think, the change to the range of sanctions that a standards committee can impose. Currently, it is pretty tight. It goes from nothing to suspension with only a warning and a smack of the wrist in between. I think we need something a little wider than that, and something that helps us to apply some proportionality to matters. I speak as a chairman of another standards committee, I won't tell you where a community councillor there, we done his French fries. I think he was pretty fortunate, and hanging wasn't one of the sanctions available to us, because I think the old committee were dead intent on sending him to jail for something minor, because I think it's their unhappiness with what had happened, but also I think it was tied a bit by the range of sanctions that are available. If they didn't think that doing nothing or warning or smack of the wrist was proportionate, so it left only one other sanction and a few others that they'd invented. Anyway, I would welcome that and the one about social media, because I think lots of councillors are getting into trouble for, what do they say, don't post till you're tired or something like that. So I would welcome those. Anybody else got anything?
Councillor Freegard, then Tom Ward, Chair.
Okay, Sharon.
Well, thank you, Chair. Tell me, I finally got the laptop working, so if you bear with me now. I've got a number of questions and comments, Craig, and forgive me if some of the answers are within the report and I've missed them. So if I could just go through it, and perhaps you could just answer at the end then, Craig, if that's okay. On page 42, where they're talking about the amendments, when are the amendments going to actually be implemented? And on the next page, in terms of the anonymity of witnesses, I wonder if you could provide some clarity around that. Does that mean that witnesses don't have to provide their names on a witness statement, or they're not named within any of the reports? Is it total anonymity for any witness? Because that raises some concerns for me on that. In terms of what you said about people have to be responsible for declaring whether they've got a criminal record, I have concerns around that, because I know of a case where for a number of years somebody sat with a criminal record, no DBS had been done. That person did not report that they did have the criminal record, which did in fact conflict with a lot of things that was discussed in terms of financial things. So I'm a bit concerned about that. Does that mean to say that we don't do DBSs on people unless there is a need to, or does DBS still stay in place? In terms of, on page 44, once again, the Standards Committee would need to have additional power to require necessary training, blah, blah, blah there. When is that? When are these things going to actually come into being? And I've got another question on page 49, if you bear with me. It talks about additional powers for Standards Committee in the executive summary, but what are they? What are our additional powers, and where are they going to be legally put down? Because we can discuss whatever we like and we can work with other forums, but if it's not legally binding and no, as the chair said, no consequences of what we want to do, and that's somewhere in between of the extremes, then there's not really much point. We're just wasting time again. I think 1.4 on page 49 raises issues of accountability. And I thought that the paragraph in page 52, the President issued guidance to restore transparency. It's the President's remit to add this power for appeals tribunal. I didn't quite understand that. If you could explain that a little bit more. I wasn't fully understanding that particular paragraph. And I thought, and I think the bit on, I can't find it now, the bit on community councils, I thought was really weak. What's been the consequence of whatever they're saying about community councils? They haven't done anything different. I mean, I couldn't see anywhere where we were going to make an impact, that was going to actually have an impact legally on community councils. So I'm looking now to see. Yeah, that was on page 80. 4.51. There's a whole paragraph there relating to community councils, but it didn't give any more, I'm not reading it as any more power or consequences for the community councils. So they were just a few things, Craig, that I just wondered if you could provide some more clarity on.
Of course I can. So I think I've got them all as I've been writing things down. If I haven't caught everything, please come back to me, Councillor.
Yeah, well, I may have more depending on your answers and depending on the other members' questions.
That's no problem at all. So in the first instance, in respect of the timescales issues as to the way things are looking. So this is ultimately the first stage of the review. I think that the hope was the review would have been capable of being concluded before May 2022, along with the recommendations that will ultimately come out of it. So this is just the phase 1 element of it. The actual recommendations of the legislative changes that are going to have to come with it to be able to implement a lot of the principles that they've adopted will hopefully be taking place throughout the course of this year. There's no definitive date at this stage as to when everything will be ready by, but the plan is apparently over the course of this year. So what would happen is Welsh Government would probably have to make regulations that would ultimately implement some of these changes, which we then as a Standards Committee would have to adopt once the legislation has been enacted. So no firm timescales have ultimately been given at this stage is probably the best way to describe it. We're just optimistic it's going to be at some point this year, but this is just summarising the completion of stage 1 of the process by identifying the various issues. The work will now be ongoing to take everything else forward. Your point with regards to the criminal behaviour as well as that of others, what that is ultimately designed to cover is if during the course of an elected member being representing their community, they are investigated or arrested in respect of a particular criminal offence, there will now be an obligation ultimately to notify monitoring officer, myself, in respect of those matters. So it's not looking about past behaviour in this sense in respect of anything. It's designed to ensure that if somebody is being investigated for a crime, the monitoring officer is also aware of it, so that notification then is ultimately given. The concept of anonymity that you mentioned, it's only where it's ultimately being reported afterwards. So, for example, there's an obligation on standards committees to prepare a decision note where they are looking to implement a sanction or they've considered a particular hearing. What the requirement will be is that no individuals are named in that decision note ultimately that ends up being published. It doesn't affect the names which are identified, for example, when a person is given evidence or signing a witness statement. It's merely about the recording of the issues ultimately that are coming forward, and there'll be a power in place to basically to keep those individuals anonymous as part of the process. Your point with regards to the role of the president of the tribunal, there are two different types of hearings that can ultimately take place: an appeal tribunal and a case tribunal. The Standards Committee's role ultimately is to consider what are called case tribunals. So that's where a complaint is ultimately made to you and you will be considering it then as a Standards Committee. However, individuals do have the right to appeal any decision that the Standards Committee make, and that would go to the appeal tribunal, which is overseen then by the president. So it's just the classification of where matters are ultimately considered for the most part is the issue that we need to consider for that. But the one we are specifically focused on are case tribunals at this point. And I think the point then you referenced on paragraph 80 about the role of community councils, I very much agree with you. At this stage, there's nothing in this report that ultimately extends any powers or gives you that role ultimately to go in and ultimately do things in more detail. What we need to see now is the outcome of the legislation and what Welsh Government will decide then to introduce and what we will have the power to then enforce as we go forward. But as it stands at this stage, yes, I agree with you. There's nothing there that changes the perception or the role of what we will be doing at the moment. Hopefully, over the course of the year, we will start seeing more of those powers coming forward. And what this report is designed to show you are the types of issues which have now been raised. And hopefully, we'll start to see more principles develop and more codification of some of the legislation around all of these elements as the year ultimately progresses. I think I've caught everything, but please do tell me if I've missed anything there.
Yeah, I think, yeah, what extra powers are we actually going to have as a committee and how would they be enforced?
At the moment, very difficult to say because I don't think Welsh Government have made the determination in that regard. The enforcement ultimately would probably come via direction powers that we could issue, which would be based in the legislation, and that legislation then would have to set out the consequences of what would happen if a member disregards an instruction ultimately of the Standards Committee. So at this stage, it's still very difficult to know until Welsh Government make that determination, I feel.
But really, Craig, for the Standards Committee, that's all that's important to me. Yeah. That's what concerns me. So we're okay in something where we haven't, you know, there's nothing has been defined for our actual committee.
Indeed, and I think all this report is ultimately doing it's not there for any sort of decision making at this point. It's there for noting and for you to understand ultimately where ultimately things will be going at this stage. And obviously then when we've got decisions which we then as a Standards Committee have that control over, we'll hopefully have that clarity to enable us to make those decisions, to adopt those protocols, and fingers crossed then we'll have something ready to implement once the detail is known.
We'll see then.
Yeah, I think that's, I share your views on it, Councillor Freegar.
Okay. Okay, Sharon, are you happy now? Well, happy-ish? You've turned your microphone off, Sharon.
Yeah, it's confirmed, like, well, this is nothing much really. I don't think this is anything until we have things, as Craig said, written down for us as a committee. Well, I don't see it. This is not really going to affect us.
Well, we are moving forward very slow. But,
Yeah.
anyway.
Thank you.
Sharon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Tom, your turn.
Yeah, thank you. My sort of questions or queries around the social media aspect of it. Number one, what sort of guidance, inverted commas, training is given to local councillors and other councillors in relation to social media profiles? And are they, the main thing for me is that even material they can retweet can still leave them open to investigation, whether it be civil or criminal. I know that in South Wales Police, there are a number of police issued social media profiles which are accessed by, for instance, the Neath neighbourhood policing team. They will have 3 or 4 people who can access that, and they obviously portray police-led views and police information that the South Wales Police want to get out there. But then when people have their own personal social media profiles, they put on there a statement saying these are the views of, or these are my personal views and not those of South Wales Police, or in this instance, Neath Talbot Borough Council. So yeah, the main query is, what is the actual training given to the people at the moment?
Thank you very much, Tom. So basically, the training tends to take 2 particular processes, and it's something actually we've been redesigning as a result of the member induction that we'll be doing this year following the local government elections. So there are 2 strands to it. The first is a social media general training issue that we provided previously, and the Ombudsman Office has also introduced some guidance as well as to the importance of following the rules in respect of social media and the principles that members need to take into account. So there's training on the operational side in some manner. There's also then more specific training which I provide in respect of code of conduct related matters and some of the principles that needs to be taken into account then as well, looking at the areas which are within our code of conduct, how, you know, the inappropriate posting, where that can lead a member down the line in case there are any ombudsman's complaints about the process, the need to be very careful with things like retweeting, reposting certain messages ultimately at that point as well. So certainly a lot of principles which need to be embedded in the code of conduct and which members need to be aware of. And I think it's something we've been very conscious of now, looking at our member induction programs going forward, to make sure the social media has a very active part of that process. So we're hoping that it's going to take 2 prongs again. We're going to be getting somebody in from a communications organisation who use social media and how people can use it as a tool and the general principles they need to be aware of. And then I'll be doing more specific legal training at that point on the principles they need to be aware of so as to not to place themselves in breach of any conduct related matters as well. So it's certainly something that does need to be at the forefront. And I think what we're seeing with some of the recommendations that come out of this report is that the code of conduct does need to be updated to reflect social media, because we're talking about a document which was adopted 2005, 2006, around that sort of time scale, when ultimately things have moved on so much and so much more communication is now being done by social media, that we need to make sure that those principles are now embedded in a certain way.
Okay, the only thing I would like to perhaps suggest, and I don't know whether it's feasible or not, is that when councillors, community councillors want to tweet things about or post things on Facebook, Instagram, whatever, in relation to council matters or local community matters, is there a way perhaps that that profile can be badged up as being Neath Talbot Borough Council?
I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, if members are forwarding or retweeting information which the council has posted, then obviously, fingers crossed, it should be made clear. I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on some of these social media sites, that they're forwarding something which has been on a council webpage, or they're replicated it in that sense. There's no specific rule that says, for example, they can't then just repost the message themselves ultimately without saying that it's taken from the council's website. The code of conduct regime doesn't allow that at this stage. But again, this could be something we could look at and trying to adopt, and just reminding members ultimately, maybe as part of any training, that if they are posting messages that are taken from other organisations, maybe it will be good practice to attribute where that information has ultimately come from in some manner. So even if we can't legally do anything about it or compel people to do it, we can encourage it as part of that process. So we can certainly build that into training issues, absolutely.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Craig.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Craig. Does anybody else have any questions for Craig on this? All quiet? Okay, so thanks very much, everybody. And can I say that this report is just for noting, so nothing further on this item. And that takes us to agenda item 8. Any other urgent items? And there are no other urgent items, so accordingly, I now declare the meeting closed. Thanks very much for attending, and